Okay, so the Menendez brothers, 35 years. Crazy, right?
It's been that long.
Yeah, 1989. Feels like yesterday sometimes. But also like a whole different world, you know?
Definitely a different world, especially when you think about how much has changed in terms of like how we talk about what happened in that case.
Right. And we're not just talking about the crime itself, like the Beverly Hills mansion, the whole thing. It's the fact that this case is back in the news. Asterisk, now asterisk, 35 years later. New evidence could change everything.
Yeah, this is serious stuff. This isn't just some like anniversary special rehashing the old details.
Exactly. So we're doing a deep dive, obviously,
Mm-hmm.
because there's a lot to unpack here, and it goes way beyond those initial headlines everyone remembers.
It's about how we view justice, how we understand abuse, particularly when it comes to these really complex family dynamics.
Heavy stuff.
Yeah.
But important stuff. So for anyone who might not remember all the details or maybe wasn't even born yet, August of '89, Lyle and Erik Menendez, two young guys, they shoot and kill their parents, Jose and Kitty Menendez, in their Beverly Hills mansion, no less.
I mean, right off the bat, the case was captivating. It had everything. Wealth, privilege, this gruesome crime.
Totally. It was like a movie, but real life, and people couldn't look away. And then, of course, the trial starts, and the defense drops this bombshell.
They're claiming self-defense, but not in the way you'd think.
Right, because initially it was all about making it look like a robbery gone wrong, which honestly, given the whole Beverly Hills setting, wasn't that far-fetched at first.
Yeah, exactly. But
The abuse allegations. Huge turning point.
Mm-hmm.
Suddenly, it's not just about whether they did it, it's asterisk, why asterisk car.
Yeah.
And that's where things went from tragic to just baffling.
Mm.
Because how do you even begin to process that kind of trauma, that kind of betrayal within a family?
And let's be honest, back then, those conversations, especially when it came to abuse allegations against a father towards his sons, it was taboo.
Completely. Like, people just didn't talk about that stuff openly, and especially not when it involved a wealthy, seemingly perfect family like the Menendez family.
Exactly. It challenged all these assumptions about family, about what goes on behind closed doors. Suddenly, no one knew who to believe, and the whole thing became this media circus.
Total media frenzy. And I think part of what made it so compelling, even disturbing, was that it forced people to confront these really uncomfortable truths. Like, abuse can happen anywhere, to anyone. Wealth and privilege don't make you immune.
It really shone a light on how little we understood about these issues back then, how much stigma surrounded them. And now here we are, all these years later, and it's like that same case, those same uncomfortable truths are demanding our attention again.
Because the world has changed, our understanding has evolved. And that's what makes this deep dive so crucial, right? Because we're not just relitigating the past, we're trying to understand what this case can teach us asterisk, now asterisk coin. And what's driving this whole thing, this new look at the Menendez brothers, is this new evidence. Specifically, we're talking about a letter, right?
Right. A letter from Erik Menendez. Detailing the abuse he claims he suffered at the hands of his father, Jose.
Okay, so this isn't just some vague rumor or hearsay. This is a first-hand account from one of the brothers, written, years after the trial.
And that's key here, because it speaks to that whole idea of delayed disclosure, which we understand so much better now than we did back in the early 90s.
So walk me through that. What's different now? Why is this new evidence being taken so seriously?
Well, for starters, our understanding of trauma, particularly childhood trauma, has evolved significantly. Back then, the idea that someone, especially a young man, might not immediately report abuse or might even struggle to articulate what happened, it wasn't as widely accepted.
It makes sense, though, right? I mean, the power dynamics within a family, the fear, the shame, all of that can prevent someone from speaking out?
Exactly, and those were factors that, frankly, weren't always given the weight they deserved back then. There was this expectation that victims would behave a certain way, would come forward immediately, and when they didn't, their stories were sometimes met with skepticism.
Which is tragic, because we know now that delayed disclosure is incredibly common, especially in cases of childhood abuse.
Absolutely. And it's one of the reasons why this new evidence is so crucial. It provides potential context for the brothers' actions, context that wasn't fully explored or even understood during the original trial.
So even though they were found guilty, even though they admitted to the killings, this new evidence could actually impact their sentences.
Potentially, yes. And that's where this whole concept of resentencing comes in. It doesn't mean they're innocent, but it does mean that a judge could reevaluate their sentences based on this new evidence, based on our current understanding of things like trauma and its impact on behavior.
So it's like hitting the pause button on the original sentence and saying, okay, given everything we know, asterisk now, asterisk, error, is this still the right call?
Exactly. It's an acknowledgement that justice isn't always static, that it can and should evolve as our understanding of the world evolves.
It's still a tough pill to swallow for some people, though, right? I mean, those were brutal crimes.
Absolutely. And there are no easy answers here. But I think what makes this case so fascinating, even after all these years, is that it forces us to confront these really uncomfortable questions about justice, about punishment, about how we hold people accountable for their actions, especially when those actions are rooted in trauma.
And we're not just talking about the legal ramifications here, right?
Mm.
This case has always had this huge cultural impact, this way of tapping into our collective anxieties about family, about secrets, about the dark side of the American dream.
Right, because on the surface, you had this picture-perfect family, wealth, privilege, the whole nine yards. But beneath the surface, there was clearly something much darker going on. And I think that dissonance, that gap between perception and reality, is something that continues to fascinate us, even disturb us.
It's like we're all still trying to make sense of it, to reconcile the different narratives, the different truths that emerged from that case.
And that's what makes this deep dive so important, because it's not just about rehashing the past. It's about using the past to better understand the present and maybe even shape the future of how we approach these incredibly complex issues.
Well said. Okay, so we've got this new evidence, this potential for resentencing, but the article you shared, it also highlights some pretty powerful reactions from those close to the case, right?
Yeah, and those reactions are really telling because they show just how divisive this case remains, even after all these years.
For sure. Like there's this one quote from the LA District Attorney Gascón where he's talking about the letter, and he says something like, there's more sensitivity today when it comes to these kinds of abuse allegations.
Which is huge, right? He's basically acknowledging that the lens through which we view these issues has shifted. What might have been dismissed or minimized back then is now being given the weight it deserves.
And it's not just him, right? The article also quotes the brother's lawyer, and he's basically arguing that they've served enough time. 30 years, he says. That's enough.
Which, again, speaks to that debate about justice versus punishment. Has enough time passed? Have they been rehabilitated? These are questions that a judge could consider during a resentencing.
Makes you think about the purpose of prison, right? Is it purely punitive, or is there also an element of rehabilitation? And if someone has changed, if they've shown remorse, should that factor into how long they remain incarcerated?
Right.
It's like, what are we trying to achieve with incarceration? Is it about punishment, or is there also this element of like redemption, of giving people a chance to turn their lives around?
It's a question a lot of people are grappling with these days, and not just in the context of this case. We're seeing it play out in debates about sentencing reform, about mass incarceration, about the very role of prisons in our society.
Totally. And I feel like this Menendez case, it's almost like a microcosm of all those bigger conversations.
100%. Because it forces us to confront these uncomfortable truths about our justice system, about how we define justice itself. Like, is justice about retribution, an eye for an eye? Or is it about something more, something restorative, something that acknowledges the complexities of human behavior?
And what really struck me in the article, too, was Erik Menendez, what he's saying, asterisk, now asterisk. Because according to his wife, he's actually calling out that recent Netflix dramatization, saying it's dishonest.
It's fascinating, right? You'd think after all this time he'd want any and all attention on his case, especially if it paints him in a sympathetic light. But this statement suggests something else is going on.
Right. It's like he's pushing back against the narrative, trying to reclaim his own story.
Which is incredibly powerful when you think about it, because for so long, his story has been told by others, by the media, by the courts. But now he's using his voice, even indirectly through his wife, to challenge those narratives.
And it makes you wonder, what is his truth? What does he want people to understand about what happened, but what he and his brother went through?
Exactly. And it reminds us that even in the age of instant information, social media, all of that, truth can be really elusive. There are always multiple perspectives, multiple sides to every story.
For sure. And I think that's what makes this deep dive so important. Because it's not about deciding who's right or wrong. It's about acknowledging the complexity, the nuance, the fact that there may not be any easy answers.
Well said. And if anything, I hope this conversation encourages people to do their own digging, to look beyond the headlines, to engage with the uncomfortable questions that this case continues to raise.
100%.
Mm.
Because that's what this is all about, right? Engaging with tough topics,
Yeah.
having these important conversations, even when they're uncomfortable. And I think we did a lot of that today, so.
We did. And honestly, it's conversations like these, even about cases as difficult and as tragic as the Menendez brothers, that remind us why these deep dives are so important. Because they force us to confront not just the darkness, but also the humanity, the complexities that exist within these stories, within ourselves. And sometimes that's the first step towards understanding, towards empathy, towards maybe, hopefully, creating a more just world.
Couldn't have said it better myself. So, for anyone listening, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. And remember, keep asking questions, keep those conversations going, because that's how we learn, that's how we grow, and that's how we make a difference.